Inquisition swept like a plague across medieval Europe. It was without question one of the darkest and bloodiest episodes in human history. A time when thousands of people accused of heresy by the Catholic Church were arrested, tried, and put to death.
It was ethnic cleansing on a huge scale. It was one faith trying to exterminate another.
There were Inquisition tribunals going on all over the country. It really was a people living in fear.
This religious fanaticism spread to Tudor England, where Catholics and Protestants did their best to wipe each other out. The persecution continued in the 18th century when countless ordinary women were drowned or burned at the stake after they were accused of being witches.
1/3 of the entire population was accused of heresy and witchcraft by the other 2/3.
The Christians were actually aiming to stamp out something that had been in place for thousands of years before then. This was a war on magic and witchcraft, but what it really was a war on people that couldn't fight back.
The world lived in the shadow of Inquisition and persecution for over 500 years. You would think we would have learned our lesson.
Thousands of heretics in this country died under the knife, the axe, or in the flames.
Queen Elizabeth I was the last of the Tudor monarchs. Her reign was a turbulent era of religious plotting and treason. We'll see why in this episode of Inquisition.
Elizabeth I is in a tough position. Think of being a Protestant country in England today, with both the United States and Russia as Islamic powers, and Prince Charles, a convert to Islam, scheming to murder his mother and kept permanently in prison, and you have some idea of how dangerous our position would be.
With France, Spain, Italy, Portugal and much of the New World in the firm grip of the Holy Inquisition in the 16th century, it was a brave king who would choose to break with mighty Rome. But Henry VIII was not only brave, he was strong and ruthless, and a devout Catholic until it prevented him from getting his own way. He was certainly not about to let religion prevent him from divorcing his first queen, Catherine of Aragon, in order to marry his beautiful mistress, Anne Boleyn. If the Catholic Church wasn't fit for purpose, he'd find one that was. His own one, in fact, the Church of England. And with the Act of Supremacy of 1534, that's exactly what he did. Henry's abrupt change of faith forced thousands of Catholics to practice their religion in secret. If they were caught, they faced the threat of trial and execution once they were found guilty. Things changed again when King Henry's fiercely Catholic daughter, Mary, eventually claimed the throne after the short reign of Edward VI in 1553.
Queen Mary spent most of her life in prison. She had seen her mother tossed aside by Henry VIII. She had seen her beloved Catholic faith outlawed. So you can imagine, by the time she gets to the throne, she's a raging torrent.
Mary only reigned for 4 years, but during those dreadful years, she did everything in her power to eradicate, to get rid of these stinking Protestant heretics that had defiled her faith for so many years while her father and brother were on the throne. And she did a very good job. She was, of course, called Bloody Mary, and she certainly lived up to her name.
As far as Mary is concerned, she is somebody chosen by God to bring England back to the true religion. And golly, God has tested her by keeping her on the receiving end of hatred, suspicion, abuse, persecution, ill treatment for most of her adult life. And then at the last minute, when she's actually destined to be arrested and thrown in the tower, or even put to death, in favour of a queen called Lady Jane Grey. That coiled spring of hatred and resentment is released. She seizes power, sweeps the country behind her to back her, and then it's payback time.
In 1558, at the age of 25, Elizabeth, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and the half-sister of Mary, succeeded to the throne of England, and the balance of religious power swung back once again to the Church of England. The Protestant Elizabeth knew all about persecution. She'd spent a year under house arrest on charges of helping Protestant rebels. It was said that she hated the brutality of Queen Mary's rule, had no time for Rome and the popes, and truly despised the Catholic Inquisition that was still sweeping across Europe. Elizabeth wanted nothing to do with these things. She believed in and supported the Church of England, and as a result, she would face many threats throughout her reign.
Queen Elizabeth's position was very difficult. Very difficult in these days. She was a Protestant. She was the daughter of the man that threw out the Catholic Church. And what you've got to remember is that the vast majority of the aristocracy was still Catholic. They were country dwellers, and they lived far away from the towns, and they clung to the old faith. And they were expecting Catholicism to come back as it had under Mary Tudor.
Elizabeth I is in a tough position. For any European ruler of her age, the threats are vicious religious conflict, constant assassination of royal leaders, murdering royals is part of the politics of the age, and ruinously expensive warfare. So she needs to be on her guard. She has no reliable Protestant heir for half her reign. She has no loyal relatives. She's got her friends, she's got her subjects, otherwise she's on her own. And don't forget, she is in a corner as the most powerful Protestant ruler of the age. Think of being a Protestant country in England today, with both the United States and Russia as Islamic powers, and Prince Charles, a convert to Islam, scheming to murder his mother and kept permanently in prison, and you have some idea of how dangerous our position would be.
Elizabeth's position was perilous, there's no doubt about it. What you've got to remember is that in those days, in the 1500s, religion meant everything. And to ask someone just to suddenly change their faith, it was very similar to asking a Derby County supporter to wear a red and white Nottingham Forest shirt. A lot of these guys would die, and a lot of people in those days were prepared to die for their faith. And there were so many plots against Queen Elizabeth. She was in a very, very, very difficult position, and she must have been terrified of being murdered, assassinated, overthrown by the Catholics. She'd got a court full of people. She was ruling, but most of the people in court were fair weather Protestants, and really deep down were still Catholics, and were waiting for the day when Philip of Spain led the Armada.
One such family were the Southworths of Samlesbury Hall near Preston in England. They were typical of many Catholic families. They didn't stop holding masses, they just held them in secret. The authorities had long suspected the Southworths of harbouring priests and plotting against the Queen, and they knew it. As a result, Samlesbury Hall, like many English stately homes and castles, was awash with secret passageways, priest holes, and places of worship. Author and historian Richard Felix is an expert on how Catholic priests were hidden away across England during Elizabeth's reign.
This is Samlesbury Hall, home of the Southworth family, staunch Roman Catholics in a Protestant England. Very dangerous times. Over here, on the left-hand side of the hall, was the chapel And of course, as Catholics, they would be celebrating Mass in there, and then it would be panic stations. Elizabeth's soldiers were on the way. They had to get the priest out and hide him as quick as possible. The close proximity here of the fireplace meant that they actually created a priest hole up here, probably created by the famous priest hole maker Nicholas Owen, who created many priest holes around the country. It's quite amazing because it's tiny. There's just enough room for a body, and there's even a space here for the head to be pushed in. This would, of course, have been covered over, I presume, with false bricks or something. But do remember, of course, that there would be a fire burning. So before he went in there, he would have to cover his robes with water to stop him burning while he was in there. He could be in there sometimes for hours, possibly even days, while Elizabeth's soldiers were rampaging through this building looking for him. If he was found, of course, it would be death.
The minority of Catholic families left by about 1580, 1590 just carry on, but they have to be really, really careful about it. They can't do it in public. They have to conceal their priests, often literally in holes in their buildings. Mass has to be celebrated in extreme privacy, and they have to look as though they're politically loyal. And if their loyalty is in doubt, they're constantly harassed. They're raided, they're watched, they're hauled in for questioning, they're thrown into preventive custody, they get the full works.
In the reign of Queen Elizabeth, Catholic worship went underground. It didn't stop, but it had to be done in secret. So imagine these old manor houses and the priest conducting a little ceremony, and all of a sudden, here come the authorities. So what are you going to do? You shove them up the chimney, or in most cases, they probably hit them under the floorboards.
Things had become very critical for Catholics. They were no longer worshipping in the chapel. They had a secret room here, the priest's room. The priest would be here, knelt in front of the cross, the family inside for Mass. Windows so you could see if anyone was coming. All of a sudden, be panic. The soldiers are coming. The Bible will be taken away and hidden in here. And, of course, locked. The cross taken down and hidden in here. The priest, then, what are we going to do with him? He had to go into one of the priest holes that were here. Through here. Still hollow. There would have been a secret entrance, probably one of these beams hinged, lifted up, the priest pushed inside, and this closed. And he would be crouching in the corner, terrified, waiting for Elizabeth's soldiers to come searching through the building. And let me show you where it is. Still here, preserved as it was, rafters, beams, just the same. The poor priest would be huddled in the corner, terrified, as Queen Elizabeth's soldiers would be literally ripping through this building, trying to find him. And, of course, if he was found, he'd be taken away, tried for high treason, and hanged, drawn, and quartered.
Needless to say, outlawing Catholic worship did not make Queen Elizabeth popular with many of the most ancient noble families in England, many of whom could trace their allegiance back to Rome several generations. As a consequence, Elizabeth had to live with the threat of assassination by Catholic plotters from a young age. To make matters worse, Elizabeth's cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, the daughter of King James V of Scotland, believed that she was the rightful heir to the throne of England. A staunch Catholic herself, Mary became a rallying point for disaffected Catholics, both north and south of the border.
Roman Catholics go down quite quickly to a small minority in Elizabeth's reign. The vast majority of the ruling class simply see that by towing the Queen's line in religion, you keep getting along, which leaves about 5% of devoted Catholic noble families, most of whom are totally loyal. They manage to get the idea you obey the Pope in religion, you obey the Queen in politics, and that should keep everybody happy. Alas, for all concerned, there's maybe 100 individuals who don't toe the line and actually want to murder Elizabeth.
The Catholic families, of course, the wealthy Catholic families, saw no wrong in what they were doing because they were sticking to the true faith, the only faith. And, of course, Queen Elizabeth, in their eyes, was illegitimate. She was the daughter of Henry VIII's second wife. And as a good Catholic, of course, Henry VIII should only have had one wife. So Queen Elizabeth was a bastard and should have been murdered. And that's exactly what they were plotting to do.
Queen Elizabeth put her trust in two key advisors, Sir Francis Walsingham and Lord Henry Cecil. These two faithful servants explained fully to the Queen the dangers to her from Catholics at home and from Roman and Spanish assassins abroad. As a result, Mary Queen of Scots was kept under house arrest in various manor houses and castles far from the royal court in London. The wily Walsingham put together a formidable network of spies and informers across England, in France and Spain, and allegedly also in Rome. He knew full well that the key to discovering and crushing plots at an early stage was to receive a constant flow of information.
Elizabeth was actually very tolerant when it comes to religious faith, but not her advisors. They were outright paranoid, particularly about Catholics, who they sought out and executed because they feared they were a threat to her reign.
But how far can you go for white wealth? You were saying you used to take something.
Well, I could bring Emily information in.
Elizabeth had a group of advisors, mainly elderly men, funnily enough, father figures. She was aware of the amount of plots that were being hatched against her, and so guys like Cecil and Walsingham set up the most amazing spy network, an early day MI5, to be quite honest with you, basically against Catholics who were plotting to invade England, to kill, to murder Queen Elizabeth. And this went right through Europe and to the lowliest people in the villages. Walsingham had a fantastic network set up.
You must be 100% sure on this. All right. I will have to put my name to this document. So we'll just be careful.
Elizabeth's spy network was absolutely crucial to her longevity on the throne. She knew who was talking about who, what, when, and why. She had spy networks from peasants to nobles. She had all of her bases covered.
Elizabeth was pretty lucky. I mean, on one occasion, a Catholic assassin actually came into her presence with a knife and lost his nerve at the last minute. But generally, we can say that had not her courtiers been so vigilant, had they not constantly infiltrated Catholic networks and kept this huge chain of spies, then Elizabeth would be dead, prematurely, violently, and extinguished politically.
And so, Walsingham launched his own inquisition against prominent Catholics in England, who were suspected of plotting on behalf of Mary, Queen of Scots. Hundreds of Catholics were arrested and tortured, and many were tried and executed for treason.
After the 4 years of terror and torture and burnings under Bloody Mary, all of those people, of course, being executed for heresy, the tables were turned. Everyone had become Protestant again, and this time the Protestants turned it against the Catholics, and they were considered heretics and traitors. But, of course, traitors not only to the Queen, but also to God. They were hunted down, soldiers burst into Catholic houses where they were celebrating Mass in secret, priests were dragged out, some of them literally executed on the spot, others taken to the county towns, the assize towns, and tried at the assizes for high treason, tortured if they wouldn't confess, exactly the same way as the Catholics were doing to the heretics before, and, of course, many of them hanged, drawn and quartered. And then the Catholic houses suffered, because if a priest was found in a house, then these guys were called recusants, and the family was taken away and imprisoned. and often hanged. But it was only the Catholic priests that were hanged, drawn and quartered.
If you're a Catholic family in the North of England or the Midlands in Elizabeth's time, you're living on your nerves for the whole of your lives. You may be raided at any moment, you may be arrested at any moment, and you're being heavily fined month by month, year by year, diminishing your wealth. The only consolation is you're absolutely certain to go to heaven. If it gets really bad, then the guards are around your house for days, waiting for your priest to get starved and smelly enough to come out of his hole.
The penalty for treason, of course, was death. But the method of execution was perhaps one of the most barbarous ever devised. A hideous and bloody punishment that was supposed to fit the crime and also to provide a grim deterrent to other would-be plotters.
Hanging, drawing, quartering was the sentence for high treason in this country, but it was not only treason against the Queen or the King, it was treason against God. And many Roman Catholic priests in this country were hanged, drawn and quartered for heresy. The sentence was that you and each of you be taken from this court to a place of execution where you will be severally hanged, but taken down while you are still alive, your privy parts cut off and burnt before your eyes, your bowels and entrails to be taken out and also burnt, your head then to be severed from your body, and that body then to be divided into 4 equal quarters, and those quarters to be at the disposal of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. This is a real drawing, quartering and beheading block. Basically, this is a butcher's block designed for human beings.
Elizabeth herself, unlike her sister, is ostentatiously not a persecutor. She makes it clear that she isn't interested in what people believe in private, just as long as they conform in public and obey her politically. But even so many Roman Catholics refuse to conform in religion, and all they're doing is celebrating their faith, holding a mass, that around 200 of them are put to death by the long drawn-out, humiliating and very public fate of hanging, drawing and quartering.
In 1571, Lord Cecil and Sir Francis Walsingham uncovered the infamous Ridolfi plot, an enterprise which involved not only the Duke of Norfolk, the wealthiest landowner in England, but also an invasion by thousands of Spanish troops. Had it succeeded, Queen Elizabeth would have been assassinated and Mary, Queen of Scots, placed on the throne. Norfolk was executed for his part in it, and the English Parliament introduced a bill barring Mary from the throne. In 1586, private letters written by Mary were intercepted by Walsingham's spies, which proved that Mary had sanctioned the attempted assassination of Elizabeth as part of the infamous Babington plot. Mary was put on trial and sentenced to death.
Elizabeth really didn't want to have her cousin executed. She fought long and hard and resisted it. Legend has it that the death warrant was actually pushed in with some of the papers, which she signed by mistake. But I don't think that was true, but Walsingham would have it. And, of course, eventually Elizabeth did sign it. She wanted it to be quiet and clandestine, but, of course, it became far from that, because there were actually 300 nobles at the execution, and it turned out to be one of the most horrendous and messy executions of any queen in British history.
The execution of a monarch is supposed to be a decorous and solemn affair, but the beheading of Mary, Queen of Scots, was anything but. It was a bloody, botched mess.
It's February the 8th, 1587. The Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots, walks slowly down the staircase of Fotheringay Castle towards the Great Hall. Waiting for her is a scaffold draped in black. On the scaffold, a block. an axe, a basket, and an executioner. Mary was wearing a black dress, but she disrobed, and underneath she was wearing a blood-red petticoat, the sign of a Catholic martyr. She prayed for a few moments, and then one of her maids placed a white handkerchief around her eyes, and she knelt down and placed her neck on the block. The executioner, Simon Bull, took up the axe and took the first swing to sever Mary's head. But it bit into the back of her head. The crowd was horrified, and Mary turned her head towards the executioner and said the words, "Sweet Jesus." She placed her neck back on the block, and Simon Bull took the second blow, and still he didn't completely sever the neck. It was hanging from a few sinews. Bull took out his knife and cut the last sinews of Mary's neck and dropped the head into the basket. It was then customary for the executioner to reach into the basket, take out the head and hold it aloft in front of the crowd as the Dean of Peterborough shouted the words, "So perish all enemies of Elizabeth!"
With Mary, Queen of Scots, gone, and most of the prominent Catholics in England cowed into submission, Elizabeth's golden age had really begun. Perhaps a crowning triumph came in 1588, the year after Mary's execution, with the famous defeat of the Spanish Armada against overwhelming odds. There'd been a long fight between Catholics and the Protestants, between the Tudors and the Popes, for the hearts and minds of England. For nearly a century, England had swung from a devout Catholic nation to a Protestant one under King Henry and Edward VI, only to revert to Catholicism under Queen Mary Tudor, and then back to being Protestant again under Queen Elizabeth. Every monarch had been beset by problems of religion, and a great many men and women of all callings had died for their faith. Plots had been hatched and thwarted by the watchful eyes of the state. Courtly and political intrigue were rife. But at the end of it all, the Protestant faith was firmly established in England, and the crown was secure.
England went through the most dreadful religious turmoil. If you can just imagine the average amount of information that a working person took in their lifetime in the 1600s, we today take in 1 week. So, in other words, all people were really bothered about was work, creation of children and their religion. And all of a sudden, these poor people are told, in the reign of Henry VIII, you're no longer a Christian, you're a Protestant. Then Mary comes along, and you're no longer a Protestant, you're a Catholic. And then, for God's sake, all of a sudden Elizabeth comes along. Oh, by the way, lads, we're all changing again. We're all going to be Protestants. People were prepared to die for their faith in those days, and thousands of them did.
Well, you lot can run away and hide if you want, but I am not going to stand by and let my family burn!
When Queen Elizabeth died on the 24th of March 1603, aged almost 70, her coffin was carried down the River Thames at night to Whitehall on a barge lit with torches. It was a touching irony that the Protestant Elizabeth should be buried next to her half-sister and staunch Catholic Mary. The inscription on their tomb simply reads, "Consorts in realm and tomb, here we sleep, Elizabeth and Mary, sisters, in hope of resurrection."
Although Elizabeth's reign was hailed as the Golden Age, which to a certain extent it was, imagine how she felt when she actually walked into Whitehall, knowing that members of her Privy Council were actually probably plotting against her, talking about her, and to be honest with you, wanting her dead, so that they could return to the true faith. Of course, when Elizabeth died in 1603, she hadn't followed the Catholic script. because, number one, she hadn't got a legitimate heir, and number two, she lived through all of the plots, 4, 5, 6 Catholic plots to assassinate her, but she died childless. She was reputedly the Virgin Queen, and she caused a big problem because she hadn't got a legitimate heir. The nearest in line for the throne of England was King James VI of Scotland, the son of the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots. And James was invited to take the throne of England, thus uniting England and Scotland, and James became King James I of England.
Elizabeth's successor came from Scotland, the first time the English and Scottish crowns had been united. James Stuart, who became James I of England, was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots. James was a baptized Catholic with an instinct for religious tolerance. There was one practice, however, that James was determined to stamp out, and that was witchcraft. His book, Demonology, which was published in 1597, set out very clearly his views on the subject.
He was absolutely paranoid about witches. He not only believed they existed, he believed they were actually out to get him. And therefore he wrote this book called The Demonology Book. And the Demonology Book was given to every magistrate in Great Britain for the sole purposes of looking for witches.
James VI of Scotland, first of England, is an intellectual, which is a problem to start off with. It's always a complication for an early modern king to be that. He goes on honeymoon to Denmark to bring back a wife. He's almost wrecked by a storm on the way back, which makes him suspicious. It's a time when interest in witches is growing in Scotland. A bunch of local women are arrested, and they're got to confess by James's men. They've taken part in a conspiracy along with a would-be rebel to destroy James by magic. Now, this is at once deeply scary, because James feels he's on the receiving end of magical hatred, and also deeply flattering. It proves he's God's regent in Scotland. Otherwise, why would the devil's agents try and destroy him? So James transforms into somebody with little interest in witches. It's becoming briefly a passionate, avid young witch hunter.
James is very interesting. I think when he was King of Scotland in the 1590s, he took a very close and personal interest in some witch trials there, partly because he felt that the witches were attacking him through magic, and it was a sort of a case of treason against the monarch. When he comes down to England, there is a change in the English law against witches, and that's actually a change to make the law more severe. So James has actually been sort of blamed for making the law against witches more severe.
James was the scourge of Scottish witches. He had hundreds of witches in Scotland tortured and burnt at the stake. But when he came over the border into England, he was the one that started the witch-hunting craze and then became the scourge of British witches as well.
The witch-hunting craze was no stronger anywhere than in England, and the trials of the so-called Pendle witches in 1612 are some of the most infamous. It's a startling tale. 12 women from the Pendle Hill area of Lancashire were charged with the murders of 10 people through the use of witchcraft. They were accused of summoning demons, of cavorting with the devil, of placing curses on others, and of making foul potions. Simon Entwistle is a local historian who's investigated the story of the Pendle witches, and he firmly believes there was a grave miscarriage of justice.
Welcome to the beautiful village of Downham. Now, every part of Great Britain has a famous story behind it, and in this part of the world, it's witchcraft. To our far, far right, we have the hypnotic, panoramic Pendle Hill. Every single year when the snows come to Pendle Hill, the last piece of snow to melt is always in the perfect shape of a white witch. Let's turn the clock back literally 400 years and the story of the Pendle Witches. Living on the slopes of Pendle Hill in small cottages with various people that just wish to live away from society. Every human being's got to eat and every human being has to have income, and their income was to beg of travellers making their way over the hill. Our story really starts, though, on the 18th of March, 1612, when young Alison Device left her cottage, known as Malkin Tower, and walked along the foothills of Pendle. She had the misfortune of meeting a pedlar called John Law from Halifax. Now, John Law was basically a walking salesman. Alison begged of him. "Oh, please, sir, just a few pins, sir. Be on your way," shouted John Law. And he very cruelly slapped the girl across the face. All of a sudden, a huge black dog came from nowhere, and the dog sat next to Alison, and the dog talked. "Alison, shall I lame him for you?" "Lame him!" she screamed. All of a sudden, Law fell to the floor and found to his horror his left arm, his left leg were completely paralysed. He lay in the hill in agony. The kind people of Combe could see him, and they sent a stretcher team to carry him down to the old alehouse, called the Greyhound. Their letters were sent back to Halifax, and the eldest son, Abraham Law, set out to pick his father up. "Father, what's happened to you? You look terrible. Been cursed. Witch on the hill. Young lass called Device. Get the magistrate. I want justice."
It was the first really big, spectacular witch trial in England, and it happened because a born-again, Puritan Christian JP called Roger Nowell bought into fears that a couple of local criminal families were worshipping Satan and destroying their neighbours by witchcraft, and went for those big time. He got a sympathetic pair of judges, he got the local community on his side, and the result was a bloodbath, or at least a noose bath.
You've been accused of consorting with beasts in the woods.
No, that can't be true. Who's been telling you these things?
And you've been accused of sending your familiar to your neighbours. You've been accused of using that knowledge to spread malicious gossip. And you've been accused of causing arguments and conflict within the village. How say you?
I didn't do it! It was not me! I didn't do it!
The accused witch, young Alison Device, was taken before Roger Nowell, the local magistrate. There, under interrogation, she admitted to being a witch. Not only that, she also incriminated her grandmother and two of her neighbours. All were arrested and sent to Lancaster Castle jail. The truth was that none of these so-called witches, who were all notorious local troublemakers and beggars, ever had the slightest chance of being acquitted.
The executions took place at what's called the pillory at Lancaster, a horrible instrument of death. They had their hands tied behind their backs. They had to mount what's called the pillory. They stood on top of the stools with ropes around their necks. The stools then kicked out from underneath them, and these people did not hang with a drop. They literally strangled to death. It was a very painful and traumatic death.
The Pendle witch trials of 1612 were not about witchcraft, were not about heresy, but were purely and simply about religion. The guys in the villages of Pendle and this area were staunch Catholics. The news hadn't reached them about the new faith, about Protestantism. They clung to the old faith, and the church had to get rid of them. They demonised them and executed them.
So as England moved into the 17th century, it left behind an intense period of persecution and fear. Almost a century had passed, where your life or death could hang on which faith you supported, where every village, town or city had informants, where England was constantly at war with either France, Spain or both. And yet the new century would bring with it another form of inquisition and heresy, the hunting down and abolition of witches.
You have to remember just how incredibly superstitious England was during the 17th century. They believed in God, they believed in fairies, they believed in demons, and they sure as hell believed in witches.
and found guilty of witchcraft, and by the law of Parliament and our Lord Protector, they shall be hung by the neck until dead.
At this time, in the 16th and 17th centuries, most people believed in magic. It was just part of everyday life. People believed in the supernatural, in God, but also in the possibility of magical intervention in everyday life. And in that context, it made a lot of sense to think that some people could use magic for harmful purposes. So it's not really hysterical or unreasonable if you live in that world and have those beliefs. So that belief was there for centuries before this time. So I think what's different about the 16th and 17th century is you get the men in power, the kings, the lawmakers, the church. They begin to get very concerned about witchcraft as a new form of heresy, as a new form of sin against God, with this belief that witches were actually in league with the devil. So I think part of what drives the witch hunts of the 16th and 17th century is actually a kind of a top-down concern on the part of the authorities that the witch is something more terrifying than before.
You have been found guilty and condemned as witch. Our Lord's Prayer.
The witch hunts get going in England in the 1560s because that's when the law against witches is brought in. The idea you must hunt witches arrives from the continent of Europe big time. And what you do then is you arrest about one person a year, occasionally a bunch of them, and try them, and 80% of them are acquitted. So you need to be senile or mad or have an incredible number of influential local enemies to get executed. But then comes the English Civil War in the 1640s, and the whole traditional system of law courts collapses. And into the vacuum steps a young man suffering from TB called Matthew Hopkins, who claims to know how to detect witches. And he and a scratch squad of witch hunters go through East Anglia, hot knives through butter, inviting the communities to bring out their suspects. He then tortures them into confession. And so probably over a quarter of the total number of people executed for witchcraft in England die in one summer, thanks to Matthew Hopkins' witch hunt. So it depends where you look. Most of the time the English are pretty restrained about putting people to death for witchcraft. But once the usual checks are gone, they're as mad about killing witches as anybody else.
I think thousands of women were probably totally innocent of the crimes against them, really. Women were persecuted, there's no two ways about it.
Thousands upon thousands of women were executed in this country. It was one of the darkest periods of England's history.